Good evening. I'm Tracy Glad, Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture. Tonight we have Dr. Markus Cruse presenting Portraying the Fantastic, Gothic Architecture and Contemporary Cinema. The Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. The next Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture will be on Wednesday, May 28th, with Dr. Robert D. Caroli presenting Gods, Ghosts, and Spirits in Buddhist Art and Tradition. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to say some thank yous. First to the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support that is so vital and deeply appreciated at the FIA. I would like to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA every day of the week for Genesee County citizens. And a big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone free entry on Saturdays beyond Genesee County. So thank you, Huntington. I would also like to note that we now have assisted listening devices available at the FIA. You can request one at the front desk or use your own Bluetooth device by scanning the QR code and downloading the Listen Wi-Fi app. The QR codes are available on the sign on either side of the entrance to the to the theater. That is also available in our Hot Shop and our Isabel Hall. Once you download the app, you should connect to the FIA ALS Wi-Fi in order for it to work properly. And so now I'd like to ask you to please silence your electronic devices. Dr. Markus Cruse is Associate Professor of French at Arizona State University. As a medievalist, he has published on a wide range of topics, including medieval theater, heraldry, writing tablets, the Louvre, Marco Polo, and global trade. He recently published a book about the Mongol archive in late medieval France and has a forthcoming work about the writer Christine de Pizan. He is a member of the Institute for Advanced Study and has twice been a fellow at the National Humanities Center. Please join me in welcoming back, because he's been here before, Dr. Markus Cruse. Please join me.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So my thanks to the FIA for this lovely invitation. My thanks to Becky and to Catherine for organizing my visit here, all the complicated logistics of getting me here. My thanks to Dr. Alan Klein, who is truly one of the great supporters of the FIA, and my thanks to you for coming out this evening. So, as you see, I'm going to be talking this evening about Gothic architecture in contemporary cinema. And I think that I should explain, first of all, how I came to this topic before I dive in, because it isn't necessarily obvious why a French medievalist would be talking to you about Gothic architecture and contemporary film. And it's actually a pretty straightforward explanation. It has to do with my teaching. Like a lot of people who teach the humanities in America and really around the world, one of the challenges that we face is attracting young people into our classes. How do you get people in their teens or early 20s interested in contemplating and studying with you either great works of literature from the past or great works of art or historical events? What do we do? It is a great challenge, and it becomes more challenging year by year. And one solution that I and other colleagues around the country have hit upon is to meet the students where they are. What do students like? Well, we know that students like fantasy literature and video games and graphic novels. We know that they like Game of Thrones and Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and these kinds of things. And within this material, there is a whole history of Western and indeed global culture to be told if you just mine the material in the right way. So what I'm going to present is based on both a course that I've been teaching for a number of years called Knights, Magic, Monsters, Medieval and Modern Fantasy, which then led to a forthcoming article. And now I think that I'm going to turn this into a book because this is a really big topic for reasons that you're about to see. So I invite you to go on this little thought journey, this little thought experiment with me this evening, and then I look forward to your comments and questions. So to begin, for centuries, architecture in Western Europe and other parts of Europe looked like this. This is the great Gothic cathedral of Reims. It was the coronation cathedral in the Champagne region in northeastern France. A mighty architecture, an architecture of authority, of power, of majesty, of divinity. And that architecture, although it was largely replaced for several centuries by classicism and neoclassicism, beginning in the 14th and 15th centuries, nonetheless, the interest in Gothic never entirely waned, and it lived on especially in Germany, France, and England, and that geography is very important, not in the Mediterranean countries, certainly not in Italy and Spain, but in the northern countries where Gothic came to be part of the national ethos and of the national identity. And then in the 19th century, Gothic has a profound revival, in particular in Germany, France, and England, and also in the United States. Does anybody recognize this building? This is St. Pat's in New York. Yeah, completed in the 1870s. So part of this 19th century Gothic revival. And this Gothic revival extended into domestic architecture. I'm sure that you, in your lifetime, perhaps even in your neighborhood now, have encountered Gothic revival or Gothic elements in domestic architecture, in homes or in other buildings that you encounter. But in the 20th century, this Gothic revival eventually wanes, and we start to get the modernist aesthetic that we are so familiar with. So we get either rectilinear forms that we associate especially with large urban projects, or we get more organic forms such as this, the Guggenheim. But you can think of any number of modern buildings, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, for example, any number of modern architects that use very complicated organic or wavy patterns. This has become very common in modern architecture. So Gothic seems to have declined considerably from the beginning of the 19th century up until the present, say for the past 100 years. And observing this, Michael Lewis, in his book titled The Gothic Revival, which he published in 2001, observed that if the Gothic is to emerge again, it will require cultural and social shifts that run deeper than stylistic fads. Now, what I'm going to argue this evening is that those cultural and social shifts have occurred. And what's interesting is that they occurred right at the moment that he published that book, around 2001, in fact. But the revival that I am talking about did not occur in the physical world. It is not in bricks and mortar. It is in pixels and digital creations and cinematic and filmic and video creations. That is where the new Gothic revival has occurred, and it has gone global, and I think that it is one of the most significant creative forces currently globally. And in particular, two films stand at the foundation of this new Gothic revival, or I should say two film series. Both film series began with releases in 2001. This is from The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, directed by Peter Jackson. That is the first example. And the other film that is at the core of the New Gothic revival is, of course, Harry Potter. The first film of the series of 8 films appeared also in 2001. Now, I want to say from the get-go, if you do not know this material, that is quite all right. You don't need to be a Potterite. You don't need to be a Tolkienian to appreciate what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is very much in the image. It's very much about the aesthetic and the cultural context. But if you do know this material, I think that you will have a new appreciation for these films. And at the very least, you will have a better understanding of what your children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews are into these days, because this is very much part of youth culture today, as I discover every semester. So I want to begin with the basics, with definitions. What do I mean when I talk about the Gothic? Well, the Gothic is a style of architecture that initially appears in the region around Paris. The first fully Gothic structure is probably the church of Saint-Denis, which is just north of Paris, just in the outskirts of Paris, right on the other side of the peripheral boulevard around Paris. You can get there to this day. You take the 13 train all the way to the end, the metro, and you're there. And it is a truly wonderful church to visit. And the Gothic goes, its heyday goes, in Northern Europe at least, until around 1500, although, as I say, the dates vary depending on where you're talking about. And Gothic formally, structurally, consists of these elements. First of all, pointed arches, as opposed to rounded arches, which we associate with first Roman architecture and later Romanesque. Medieval architecture inspired by Roman architecture. We call that Romanesque. After that, we get Gothic with its pointed arches. We also associate tall and wide windows on multiple stories with Gothic structures. Gothic structures are well illuminated compared to the buildings that had come before. And we associate rib or ribbed vaults on the interiors. The ribs provide a kind of skeleton which holds up the heavy stone vaults. And we associate exterior buttressing, which is to say truncated walls that meet the main wall at 90 degrees, and that's a very ancient support system that was pre-existed Gothic. But what was new in Gothic were the flying buttresses, what look like oars or arms or bridges that project out from the upper stories of the main vessel of Gothic structures and keep those vaults from flexing out and collapsing. Then the term Gothic itself has a very interesting cultural history. It comes, of course, from the Goths, and it's a term that was coined, as far as we can tell, by Italian Renaissance historians and critics. And the Goths had sacked Rome in the time of St. Augustine in the 5th century and thereafter. So the Goths were associated with barbarism, mindless destruction, a lack of culture. So Gothic architecture was a term used to describe what was perceived by people who wanted a classical aesthetic as an architecture that was barbaric, non-classical, and northern in its style, non-Mediterranean, non-Roman. So this is, in a nutshell, the formal and the cultural history of Gothic in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. What are some examples of this? Well, a great example is this right here, right? Newly renovated Notre Dame, constructed beginning in the 12th century, that first iteration of the cathedral completed in the 14th, and you can see the elements that I was talking about. Here we have the great flying buttresses. We have our large windows on multiple stories. You can see these windows here as well, and more of the flying buttresses here. The beautiful rose window here, famous rose window here. Lots of sculpture, lots of decoration, and of course, a very vertical, massive architecture that dominates the surroundings. The interior of Notre Dame, this is taken before the fire, so it's a lot gloomier than it is now. We see the ribbed vaults here, the ribs, these bands of stone that intersect at these keystones up here to keep all of these vault stones up in the air. We have multiple openings on multiple stories. It's a 3-story structure here, 3-story elevation. That's looking down towards the choir, so it's an axial layout. You walk in down here at the west end, and you are immediately projected. Your gaze is brought down, attracted down towards the choir and the altar down at this end. But here's the thing about Gothic that is very interesting. From the beginning, Gothic form, pointed arches, stained glass, flying buttresses, all of these elements that we associate with Gothic were not only rendered in 3 dimensions for buildings. Gothic already in the medieval period was a portable style. It was, to use a fancy word, intermedial. That means that it went across media. So not only was it present in architecture, in these examples that you see here, it was used as a slightly projecting low relief frame in altarpieces. This is very, very typical of panel painting in the especially 14th and 15th centuries. This is Simone Martini's Annunciation in the Uffizi from 1333. You see very clearly here the beautiful Gothic tracery that is as if it were right out of a pattern book copying a cathedral. Or down here, one of my favorite objects, this is at the Met Cloisters, which is the medieval branch of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And sidebar, you will be hearing here at the FIA in just a few weeks, if I'm not mistaken, from the curator, the director of the medieval department at the Metropolitan Museum, Griffith Mann. We'll be talking here at the FIA. And I've been lecturing at the Cloisters for over 28 years, so I'm very familiar with that collection as well. Can you see what this is? This is a reliquary, and it's only about yay big. It's not that big, all right? The perspective is skewed from this very large picture I'm showing you. But it is exquisitely detailed, and you can see that we have Gothic arches and tracery here. We have these enamel panels, these wings that project out, and these fold around the structure. And this reliquary, which is made out of gilt copper with this enamel and these sculptures here of the Virgin and Child and angels, all of this is mimicking the architectural form, especially of the Sainte-Chapelle, the Palatine, that's to say royal chapel, constructed by St. Louis, Louis IX, King of France, between 1241 and 1248. This was made in Paris between 1325 and 1350. So I'm showing you this because it is Gothic architecture on a miniature scale in metal, but using that Gothic architectural vocabulary to create a reliquary to evoke divinity, sanctity, protection, all of the things that Gothic was associated with. 2 more examples, pardon me. On the left, we have a tapestry, also at the Met Cloisters. This is either Alexander the Great or Hector of Troy. This tapestry is about this size. This is about the exact size of the tapestry. And you can see again that these figures are set into Gothic architecture. Can you all see that? These niches and the architectural projections and the pointed arches. And we have, slightly visible up here, we have some ribs. There's a rib vault that this king sits under. And then on the right, this is, it's silly to show this big because it's a manuscript leaf. It's a page from a book. It's only about this big. Okay, it's very tiny. But having it blown up to this size gives you a sense of the exquisite detail in this image, which, although it is small, is truly monumental in its effect. And here you can see that we are inside a Gothic cathedral, and this, in fact, is Notre Dame. And here are these rib vaults again. We can see some beautiful windows here in the background. So already in the Middle Ages, they understand that Gothic architecture is not simply for building, it also has symbolic value. It can evoke any number of associations: royalty, divinity, majesty, power, wealth, sanctity, eternity, salvation, you name it. There are any number of meanings that become attached very quickly to this style of architecture. And one thing that I'm arguing this evening is that those associations have never died. Even now, people who know nothing about the Middle Ages have seen enough Gothic structures in enough different contexts to have, if only a vague appreciation of the power and meaning of Gothic architecture. Now, one of the reasons for that, one of the reasons that we still understand Gothic and its symbolic associations has to do with what is known as the Gothic Revival. So I've just repurposed this term. We can call it the digital Gothic Revival or the new Gothic Revival. That's what I'm going to be arguing for. But in fact, there was a first Gothic Revival that has been very, very well studied, that to this day continues to fascinate art historians and historians. And this first Gothic Revival was motivated by three primary cultural phenomena. The first was antiquarianism and preservation, especially in Northern Europe. We started to get, first in France and England and later in other European countries, a great interest in the monuments and the buildings and the styles of the national past. And this development of antiquarianism mirrored very closely developments in scientific thinking. So just as in the sciences they are trying to catalog different kinds of animals, so we have biological classification, or different kinds of rocks, we have the beginnings of geology in the 18th century, so do we also have antiquarianism, which is trying to catalog old buildings and old building styles, and which is also interested in renovation and preserving these old structures. So intimately tied to this is nationalism. You're interested in this past because you see it as foundational and essential to a core national identity, which is eternal, which is unchanging, which is tied to the land. And as I said earlier, and bears repeating now, one reason that Gothic held on, especially in places like Germany, England, and France, is that these lands were either peripheral to the Roman Empire or long resisted the Roman Empire and Roman influence, and developed in the post-Roman period an identity that was largely based in opposition to Rome. So despite the fact that Rome is a model for so many things and Latin is the language of education, there are nonetheless movements within France, Germany, and England, going back arguably to the Middle Ages, that are about valorizing national language, national identity, national history, up and against Rome. So Gothic comes to be viewed, especially in Germany, France, and England, as an architecture that is native, that is ancient, and that is non-Roman, and therefore that is pure, that goes to the heart of who they are. This is what our ancestors valued, this is their style, it's not classical, and we are going to valorize that. We are going to appreciate that fact. And then finally, the third major phenomenon driving the Gothic revival is Romanticism, is a fascination with the emotional, with the irrational, with the transcendent, with, in some cases, the morbid. And let me explain now how all of this plays out in terms of actual examples. So let's return to Notre Dame. Notre Dame undergoes a first major period of restoration between 1844 and 1864 at the hands of a man named Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who was one of the great designers and architects and restorers and historians of the 19th century. And Viollet-le-Duc is charged with restoring a Notre Dame that had been vandalized during the French Revolution, a Notre Dame about which there were debates as to whether or not it should be destroyed during the French Revolution and thereafter. You may know the famous story, which is probably at least partly true, that upon the publication of Victor Hugo's novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, in 1831, there was a movement to preserve this cathedral. And thereafter, there are these moves to restore the cathedral to its former glories, and that is what Viollet-le-Duc does. Now, why would you do this? Why does the cathedral go from being an object of potential demolition to being valued in such a short time? Well, the answer is that there is a renewal of French nationalism and nationalist pride. There's also a renewal of French Catholicism in these decades. And Notre Dame goes from being something that is seen as archaic, as barbaric, as out of touch, as representing an oppressive Catholic Church and oppressive monarchy, to something that represents the national soul and national history. It becomes the very manifestation in stone of French identity and all that the French have gone through and who they are. And so there is nationalism in this, there is antiquarianism in this, because Viollet-le-Duc writes an encyclopedia of medieval architecture as he is restoring this cathedral. He is one of the first great organizers and students of styles in medieval architecture. And then there's Romanticism, because there is this deep feeling for the country and for its history that the cathedral comes to represent. So if you're wondering why they were able to renovate Notre Dame so quickly, why it just opened in December of 24 after a devastating fire that almost destroyed it 5 years before, this is why. Because the cathedral still means this to the French to this day. This story is not a story of the past that I'm telling you about the Gothic revival. It is still very much true, especially in places like France. Here's another great example of the Gothic revival. I'm sure that most of you have seen this. These, of course, are the Houses of Parliament, Parliament of Westminster. See the dates, exactly contemporary with the renovation of Notre Dame in Paris by Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin. Pugin, who, by the way, was the son of a Frenchman, so you start to see the international connections. And as with Notre Dame, what do we have here? Well, there were debates about how this building should be renovated after the Great Fire. Should it be classical? That was the obvious choice, because classical architecture is what you associate with governmental power in Western Europe, of course. We want to harken back to Rome. Think about our government buildings in Washington, D.C. But ultimately it was decided that no, to express England's native genius, to express its cultural independence, to express its own national purity and essence, Gothic architecture was more appropriate. And I should point out that Pugin wrote a great deal about this. Pugin was not only an architect, he was an agitator. He was even a provocateur. He was someone who very strongly felt that Gothic was the pure English style and that it should be used much, much more in civic life and for church architecture. And he won. He won that debate. Now, I mentioned Romanticism. And in fact, there are two aspects to the Romantic influence on the Gothic revival. The first one is what I refer to as the bright Gothic. This is the Gothic of the heavenly, the transcendent, the majestic, the pure, the salvific. And here what I'm showing you is one of the great examples, a painting by Caspar David Friedrich known as The Cathedral. And what you can see is that we have a cathedral that is here up in heaven. In the foreground we have these angels. This is a cathedral that is completely divorced from reality or from any terrestrial, mundane, human, physical reality. It is a kind of Platonic or spiritual idea of the Gothic. It is the church as representative of human yearning for salvation and eternal closeness with the divine. So that's the bright Gothic. But what's interesting about Friedrich is, like many of the people who produced art during the Gothic revival period, he was also fascinated by the dark Gothic. And you may be familiar with this side of Friedrich as well, because we have both sides of the Gothic in his work. So what do we have here? We have monks who are barely visible in the foreground, who are walking through this barren wood. We have these beautiful, scraggly silhouettes of these trees that seem almost agitated and lifelike, animated in their silhouettes. And then, of course, we have the ruin of this very prominently Gothic structure. This is the Gothic of ephemerality, of mortality, of decay, of the macabre, of doubt. And if you've ever wondered why in contemporary culture, people who dye their hair black, wear black clothing, listen to certain kinds of music, are called Goths. This is why. There is a genealogy that traces contemporary Gothic culture back through German Expressionism to the Gothic revival. That's where that whole aesthetic comes from. It ultimately can be grounded in the Romantic, dark Gothic. So this is the Gothic revival, and it establishes a great deal of the language for contemporary uses of Gothic architecture in cinema and other contexts. It creates the language of symbolic form that we are now going to dive into. So now I want to discuss the ways in which Gothic in film in particular is used to create a sense of history, of backstory, of temporal depth around a story world. And I want to begin with this really evocative quote. Ramsey Avery is the production designer for The Rings of Power. The Rings of Power series is produced by Amazon, and it's based on intellectual property that belongs to the Tolkien Foundation. It's based on stories that Tolkien wrote during his lifetime and either did not publish, or works that were published posthumously, or some works that were reworked by his son Christopher. And it's had 2 seasons now. Not great successes, but it had more success the second season. But it's going to continue because Amazon paid a fortune for this IP. So they have no choice but to keep going and try to make a big profit off of it. But this is, I think, really interesting. So let's read this together. I think for a fantasy world to be tangible, you have to actually believe that you're in it. You have to look for those touchstones of reality, whether it's continuity or whether it's a contrast with history. So what he's saying is that even though you are making a fantasy series, creating a fantasy story world, nonetheless, there are ways to use realistic details in order to associate meaning and value into scenes, in order to create character, in order to evoke the stakes within certain conflicts, in order to create senses of power and hierarchy and history. All of these things can be done with architecture. So to explain how that can work, I'm going to focus in this section on the Harry Potter films. Bless you. And here we have the model of Hogwarts that is on display at the Harry Potter Museum in the UK, which several of my students have gone to. I haven't gone yet, but I'm planning on going. But you can see how beautifully detailed this is. And what's interesting about this is that it is a real hodgepodge. Can you all see that? Because you have you have Romanesque architecture here. This looks very much like Romanesque structures, and I'll give you a couple of names here in a moment. And you may actually recognize these if you've been to Normandy, for example. Then we have these round towers that look very much like castle architecture on steroids. We have here what looks like a Romanesque bridge. Then over here we have what appears to be a Gothic chapel, and spires everywhere. So it's a combination of both lay architecture, castles, and ecclesiastical architecture, churches and chapels. So a very interesting hodgepodge. So no building in the Middle Ages ever looked like this on its own, but any number of buildings together get you this. What are those buildings? Well, here is what Hogwarts is based on. First of all, it's based on medieval monasteries, and I'll show you how that works in just a moment. We can point to Westminster Abbey, or the Abbaye aux Hommes, right? So there we go. That's in Caen, that's in Normandy, and that church still stands. An 11th century church, and the Great Hall of Hogwarts looks very much like that building, the Abbaye aux Hommes in particular. They clearly modeled it on that. Hogwarts is also based on cathedrals. It's based on the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, more about that in a moment. It's based on the dining hall of Christ Church College in Oxford. It looks like the interiors and exteriors at Oxford and Cambridge, where in fact they filmed the movies. And it looks like Gothic revival designs as well. The interiors look a lot like churches with church furnishings. We also have medieval furniture, we have stained glass windows, we have tapestries, etc. Now, trust me, we could have spent not only an evening on this, we could spend a whole semester just on the ways in which Harry Potter recycles medieval art and architecture. It's actually quite a fascinating topic. And before I dive into this any further, this is one thing that I want to establish very clearly. What we're talking about this evening is not superficial, and it's not simply the use of the past for entertainment or to make money. It is all of those things, of course. But one thing that I would like you to appreciate, and that's why I gave you the quote from Ramsey Avery just now, is that the people who make these films treat this artistic legacy very seriously. They are themselves art historians. These are people who have studied a great deal. And I make this point when I teach for obvious reasons. I want my students to appreciate that a lot of the popular culture that they consume doesn't come from nowhere. You don't just sit down and imagine these worlds, especially visually. It doesn't happen that way. You have to have read and you have to have studied a great deal. A great deal. You have to have paid very close attention to the art of the past in order to render these worlds. And that's one of the reasons that I love them so much. So this is Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire in England. This is from the 12th century. It was a Cistercian abbey. And as you can see, it is one of the great examples of a romantic Gothic ruin. Do you all see that? Without the roof, the skeletal remains of this building, which evokes deep time, the ephemeral, the transient nature of life, mortality, but also beauty and the soul of the nation. It's very romantic. It ties in with all of these associations that we've been discussing so far. Well, when they got to designing Hogwarts, this is what the Hogwarts courtyard looks like. It looks just like a ruined medieval cloister space. And they're, of course, drawing on this very ancient idea of what monasteries look like, and then they're drawing on the Gothic revival idea of the romantic ruin. Now, why would they do this? They would do this because they're trying to evoke what the book describes, which is that Hogwarts is 1,000 years old, that this is a structure that has been around for a very long time, and that it has a very long history, that parts of it are decrepit. But more than that, that it has secrets, that it has trauma, that it has mystery and mystical aspects to it. And how do you evoke all of that when you don't have 7 books to tell the story? How do you do this visually? Well, you draw on the history of Gothic's use, both in the Middle Ages and during the Gothic revival. You evoke the nationalistic and the antiquarian and the romantic. And that is how you create visually a story world using Gothic architecture. Here is the cloister at New College, Oxford, and this is a location in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the 4th film, and you can see that we have very prominently this Gothic tracery here, very, very beautiful large Gothic windows up here with this beautiful elaborate tracery here. And if we juxtapose this to the film, here's Harry Potter, here's Daniel Radcliffe walking across the green. He's walking right through here in the cloister space. So the camera doesn't need to dwell on this architecture. We don't need to have exposition about, hey, look at the old architecture. We simply register it. It becomes part of the story world, and we move on. That is how the architecture is used in these films and many others. Here we have the fountain in the center of that courtyard that I just showed you. And notice that we have these gargoyles that have been taken down from a cathedral and stuck onto this very romantic-looking, Gothic-inspired fountain, which we're meant to understand is very, very old, very ancient. In the background, we can see this Gothic tracery, and here we have some of the film's actors. And if we compare this Gothic tracery in this space to either our Oxford cloister or over here, the cloister at Salisbury Cathedral, we can see the kinds of inspiration that they're drawing on. So, to be more specific, not only are the filmmakers drawing on the idea that Gothic is old-timey, that it's archaic, that it takes us back to this medieval past, they are specifically drawing on English architectural history. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Harry Potter books, they are very, very English. They celebrate English identity. And the films are very true to that. The films were made in England by English producers and largely English cast and crew. And they really are, in many ways, a celebration of English architectural patrimony. And that is by design. And that ties in with the function of the books as well. Another aspect of Hogwarts, another inspiration, is drawn from this. The Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, again, 1241 to 1248. Located on the Ile de la Cité, this was the private chapel of King Louis IX, who reigned 1226 to 1270. His private apartments connected directly to the upper story of this church. This is his private chapel, and then down here was the local chapel for the people who worked in the palace. But this was the king and his entourage's private space up here. And this is basically a life-size reliquary for relics of Christ's passion, including the crown of thorns and the nails of the cross and pieces of the true cross. So as you see, it is a very vertical architecture. We have very large buttresses, but no flying buttresses. And we have these extraordinary windows and this beautiful spire. This is a 19th century reconstruction here. And if we compare this to Hogwarts, I think that it jumps out immediately, the inspiration. I think you can see very clearly what I'm talking about, and I'll juxtapose them. You can see that we have a similar use of buttresses on the side, very large Gothic windows, very steeply pitched roof, a large spire at the top. Clearly, we are in the world, the realm of the Sainte-Chapelle. So Hogwarts, the design, uses Gothic architecture to evoke the sacred, the mystical, a magical world that is ancient and that is thoroughly Gothic and medieval in its inspiration. This is one of the keys to making this magical on screen, is to have this medieval source material. The next topic that I want to address is the way in which cinematic Gothic creates a sense of hierarchy in these films. So again, we have books that are the basis for these movies, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. If you've read the Lord of the Rings series, you know that we have The Hobbit and then we have the trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, The Return of the King. Tolkien created a whole cosmology, a whole mythos that is vast. It is equal to any of the great religious traditions. It is equal to any of the great epic or mythic or fantasy traditions that preceded it or came after it and have been inspired by it. It is astonishingly complicated. How do you evoke a world with that kind of complexity and depth on the screen with minimal exposition? What can you do visually in terms of setting and costume and design to evoke that world? Well, one thing you can do is use architectural form. So here is another wonderful quote. Again, I want you to appreciate the care, the craft, the time that goes into making these movies and these series. Alan Lee is one of the greatest living illustrators of fantasy work. And he had illustrated Tolkien's books, and Peter Jackson, the director of the Lord of the Rings films, went right to him. He said, "Your aesthetic is Tolkien. You visualize the world perfectly. I want you for the films." And so he hired him and he brought him to New Zealand. And Alan Lee writes, "Everything for the films had to be designed as an artifact that could have been created by one of the cultures of Middle-earth. Settings had to be pause button-proof." I love that. See what I mean? They didn't just expect that the camera would pan past things and it would be blurry and you might notice it out of the corner of your eye. No. They made very detailed models. And when they couldn't do that, they made very carefully rendered 3D visualizations through their advanced programs. And they created these worlds where you can indeed pause the button and just immerse yourself in the perspective, in the three-dimensionality of the buildings and the sets that they create. It's quite remarkable. So I'll give you some examples. So as we think about hierarchy specifically, these story worlds that have all kinds of different beings, and some beings are elite and powerful and magical and even immortal, whereas other beings are very humble, very simple, mortal, vulnerable. So how do you evoke that? Well, one way to evoke that is through building design, through the language of architectural form. So here we are in the town of the hobbits. The hobbits are these humanoids. They're related to men, Tolkien says. They're actually a kind of human, but they're very small. They look like children to people when they're full grown. And hobbits live in houses that are built into the ground. And so they chose for the film a very basic geometric vocabulary for hobbit design. So what is hobbit design? It is circles and it is triangles. In some cases, it is squares, it's rectilinear. But that's it. And otherwise, the hobbits don't build large buildings, they don't have big towns, they certainly don't have big cities. They are rural, and they are Tolkien's homage to the English rural countryside and its communities. So it's an architecture of simplicity. It's an architecture of humility. As opposed to something like this. This is Orthanc, which, as described in the books, is the tower of the wizard Saruman, who starts out good and then is corrupted and becomes evil. But this was actually built by humans, by the Númenóreans, long, long ago. And you can see that it is mighty, it is dark, it is massive, and it is in this majestic setting. So very, very different from Hobbiton and from the Hobbits. Immediately you can see how architectural form evokes a great distance socially, existentially, between the hobbits at the low end and someone like Saruman, whoever inhabits this tower, on the high end. Well, here's what Tolkien says about Orthanc in The Two Towers. It was fashioned by the builders of old, and yet it seemed a thing not made by the craft of men, but riven from the bones of the earth in the ancient torment of the hills. A peak and isle of rock it was, black and gleaming hard. 4 mighty piers of many-sided stone were welded into one, but near the summit they opened into gaping horns, their pinnacles sharp as the points of spears, keen-edged as knives. So Tolkien himself, in a kind of exposition or description passage, sets the reader up for how they should understand this building, which is going to become a major setting in his novels and also in the films. But imagine that you're Alan Lee and the design team. Imagine that that's all you have to go on, because that is all that you have to go on. Tolkien doesn't say, by the way, if you're going to make a movie of this book, this is what it should look like. No, there's no help. And if you look online at various artists' renditions of this over the years, it's fascinating because they can be quite different. Quite different. But what Alan Lee and his team came up with was actually very inspired. They went to Gothic architecture. They thought to themselves, well, what are wizards like? Well, wizards are like bishops. They're like priests. They're like clerics. They're their own special order. They're all men. They're celibate. They're mighty. They have arcane knowledge. They speak multiple languages. They wear robes. They have long beards. They're basically modeled on Catholic clergy, especially in the Middle Ages. So let's look at that architecture. So this is just one example. This is not, to my knowledge, something that they drew on. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just giving you a great example of how Gothic can be used to inspire cinematic design. One thing I want you to notice is that there are these piers. See that at the corners here? Keep that in mind. And then we have these beautiful crocket spires that protrude from the top. And then look at how the building dominates the city around it. Here's an even better angle of that. You see that on the left? Look how it just protrudes above the town. It's quite impressive. And of course, many Gothic buildings do this. If you've traveled around Europe and you've gone to any number of old villages across Europe, you've seen this exact effect before. So what is Orthanc? Well, Orthanc is effectively 4 mighty Gothic buttresses that have been blown up to skyscraper size and then welded together in the middle. Is that not beautiful? Isn't that extraordinary? Beautifully done. And then instead of these spires, we have, of course, the horns, as Tolkien says. But you can see how these are reminiscent of Gothic spires. And then if you look more carefully, you can see Gothic windows. And you can see that there are these ridges, these indentations in the side of the structure all the way up, which echo buttresses, which echo the kinds of supports that we have on the edges, the outsides of Gothic structures. And we have as well these protruding hooks, which remind me not only of crockets that project off of these spires, but also gargoyles. They're a transformation, or if you will, a deformation of Gothic architecture, a kind of unwholesome transformation of Gothic, a menacing transformation. So, Orthanc uses the language of Gothic architecture to evoke might, power, eternity, the mysterious, the mystic, and the powers that exist within the story world of The Lord of the Rings. And so if you've seen the films, you know that the transition, the movement through space from Hobbiton to places like Orthanc or Mordor or Rohan is quite extraordinary because the settings themselves and the buildings themselves speak. They create meaning within the films. They help to build the story world. Now, another thing that's interesting about the filming of Orthanc is how they use the aesthetic of photography and the filming of Gothic itself. So I'm sure that everybody here has seen a Gothic cathedral at some point, either in the States or in Europe, and you've had that feeling, which the photographer here clearly has, that as you approach the building, it soars. It's almost hard to take in all of the Gothic facade, all of the Gothic structure, the more you approach it. And that feeling of overwhelming size and the might and the majesty that goes along with it is something that the director, Peter Jackson, evoked in the first Lord of the Rings film. When Gandalf rides up to Orthanc, we follow him through a point of view shot, and the camera cannot tilt enough to take in all of the mass of the tower. And it's as if you were standing at the foot of a Gothic structure and looking up and trying to take in all of the detail and look all the way and angle your camera. Perhaps you've had that experience before with your phone or your camera, trying to get the entire facade within your lens. And it's very hard to do the closer you get, and sometimes you just can't do it. You have to sacrifice part of the structure. And here, as we get close, we can see more clearly this menacing gargoyle-like hook projection. We can see the indentations that echo buttresses. We can see these windows, which are either Romanesque or Gothic, depending on what floor we're on here. We have some Gothic arches up here. So again, a building that is drawing on various Gothic aesthetics, especially those of the representation of Gothic in the Gothic revival and in contemporary photography, to evoke the might and majesty of those who live in the building. Here's another example of transcendent Gothic, but this is more of a bright Gothic as opposed to the dark Gothic of Orthanc, because here we are in Lothlorien, which is a forest where our heroes go in the course of the first Lord of the Rings film. Lothlorien is inhabited by the elves. The elves are immortals. They are at the high end of the chain of being within Tolkien's cosmogony. They are immortal, they are magical, they are beings of light, they are good, they have deep, deep wisdom and knowledge. And so what we have is our heroes, barely visible here in silhouette, walking up this beautiful Gothic stairway, which is going to take them up to a platform where they're going to have an audience with two elves, the king and queen of Lothlorien, who are two of the most powerful and most wonderful beings in Middle-earth. So what did they do to evoke this sense of transcendence and power and eternity and wisdom and mysticism? They took Gothic arches And they took, in particular, Gothic flamboyant tracery, which has very intricate patterning, which you can see up here in the vaults. And they lit it in such a way that it appears that the light is literally emanating from the structure itself. It's almost as if the structure were made of light. It is very beautiful. It is very transcendent. It is very mystical. And it is a way of evoking visually, without any exposition, the fact that these very mortal, mundane human characters are literally ascending, not just spatially, but also metaphysically. They are moving up into the realm of the immortals, of great wisdom, of eternity. And it's beautifully done. It's a beautiful use, again, of Gothic design to evoke the transcendent and these romantic notions of bright Gothic that we were talking about before. So if we compare these three examples of the use of architectural language to evoke hierarchy, now I think it's very clear what we're talking about. The mundane, the earthbound, the simple, the transcendent, the immortal, the wise, the beautiful, and the dark, the doubtful, the menacing, the threatening, but also the mighty. And what's wonderful about this use of this architecture, then, is that in fact it ties into the great paradox at the heart of the books, which is that the most powerful figure, the demonic figure of Sauron, is defeated ultimately not by these people, not by the wizards, but by the hobbits. They're the ones who win, who save Middle-earth. And so architecture is used to evoke hierarchy and also make it seem impossible for Frodo to succeed in destroying the ring and saving Middle-earth. So it's very, very effective in that way. I'll give you one example from Harry Potter. How do you evoke hierarchy in a world that is divided between muggles, non-magical humans, and wizards and witches who are born magical, and who are able to exist in both the muggle world, the mundane world, but can also pass into this magical world, which is effectively a retelling of the world of Avalon, which in Celtic lore is the elf or fairy realm. That's what the magicals can do in Harry Potter. They can go back and forth, but the muggles can't. Well, one thing that you do is you evoke our world, that of muggles, through the most mundane architecture possible, right? So this is where Harry Potter lives, with his aunt and uncle and his cousin. And like any orphan who's mistreated, he lives in a little hole, basically, a closet under the stairway, right? He's completely mistreated, he's marginalized within the family. It's a classic tale of the orphan who turns out to be a prince or a king. So compare that to the first time that we see Hogwarts, the wizarding school. There it is in the first film. Now, what's interesting about this particular shot is that we have the students floating along the lake, approaching it. But what I like is the way that it is projected on the top of the hill here. That corresponds to the book's description, but even more, it corresponds to representations of Gothic structures during the Gothic revival. One of the ways to evoke the romanticism of Gothic monuments, King Arthur's castle, whatever it may be, was to situate it on a height. And so we have many paintings and engravings from the 19th century, illustrations of books or standalone artworks that will show a Gothic structure on a height in the distance. And that's exactly what they've done in this film. And so if you juxtapose the house to this without any need for major exposition about how unpowerful the non-magical humans are and how powerful the wizards are, without any deep explanation of that history or any of it, you understand immediately that this is another world, thanks to this architecture and the way that it is situated on a height. And all of that is derived from a long history of representing Gothic architecture. The final topic that I want to address concerns how cinematic Gothic evokes moral order. And this, I think, is perhaps the most obvious to anyone who has seen any number of science fiction or superhero or fantasy films in the past 20 years. It's almost a cliche, and we'll talk about that. So what do I mean? What I mean is that most fantasy literature and much science fiction, you'd be surprised how much, derives from medieval literature. The Western Middle Ages established the template for most of what we read in fantasy and much of what we read in science fiction. And because of that, Western medieval literature was very much concerned with the medieval moral order. It was a Catholic society. It believed in a kind of Manichaean distinction between God and the devil, good and evil. And so heroism as it is defined in the medieval West is very much within a religious context. And heroes are good, and villains are bad, and there isn't a lot of gray. There is to a certain extent in certain works, but for the most part, it's a very black and white moral universe. Now, we take that for granted in the West, but that is not something to take for granted. Other cultures do not see storytelling in the same way. They don't think of heroism in the same way. So, because the stories themselves derive from this medieval moral order, it's very appropriate that Gothic architecture is often called upon to do symbolic work in these stories. By the way, I mentioned science fiction, so if you're not following what I mean, a great example is Star Wars. Do you know what Star Wars is? It's the retelling of the story of Percival. Percival is the knight who is effectively an orphan, who doesn't know that he is the son of a great warrior, who was raised without that knowledge and without training, who then discovers the truth of his birth, becomes powerful through initiation, fights a dark lord, in this case he fights various enemies, saves princesses, sound familiar? The Death Star, Princess Leia, right? That's what Star Wars is. It's an Arthurian tale set in an impossibly futuristic ancient past somewhere in the galaxy far, far away. Okay. So, let's begin with an obvious example, which is the world of Harry Potter. Voldemort is described in the books and looks in the films satanic. He looks like a snake. The name Voldemort is French for flight of death. He is like the angel of death. By the way, the angel of death in Exodus is the angel that kills children. Voldemort likes to kill children. He is truly the embodiment of evil. It's an absolute evil in a very biblical Christian sense. And so this battle in the last film, the final battle between Harry Potter, who is here, and Voldemort here, is set in the courtyard of Hogwarts, whereas in the books it is set inside the Great Hall. But here they've destroyed much of the Great Hall, and they set it outside for cinematic reasons. Now, to me, what is truly fascinating about this scene is the way that they use the set to evoke not just fighting and battle and warfare, but a very, very deep history of moral conflict. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, again, we see that this is a Gothic space. Can you all see that? This is all thoroughly medieval in its inspiration. Here we have our Gothic arches with Gothic tracery. Here we have our gargoyles. This is, of course, a massive Gothic structure. So we have an evocation of a sacred space, a space that has been defiled by death and violence, by the commission of the most heinous crimes, the killing of children, by this satanic figure. But the layering of moral messaging is even more complicated. Because if you look very carefully, you can see these rubble piles here, these heaps of stone. And for those of you who are familiar with World War II imagery, this may be very familiar. Because what this also looks like is sites in England and other places in Europe during the Blitz and during fighting in World War II. And so as I was researching this project, I came across an interview with Stuart Craig, who was the production designer for the Harry Potter films. And he says of this scene, we went back and we looked at images of urban damage from World War II, and in particular, those of, what was the English city? Along with Rotterdam and Dresden. In England, we have Coventry, which was bombed to smithereens. He said we looked at those images of urban destruction, and we drew on those for our inspiration for our design. Now, the reason that that's so interesting to me is that we have then this cultural palimpsest, this layering of meaning and reference, because Voldemort is in many ways like a Nazi. He has a racial ideology. The magical should rule, the non-magical should either not exist or should be enslaved. That's his idea, and that's what the books discuss and what plays out throughout the 7 novels. So what you have here is actually a fairly culturally rich, layered, and complicated scene once you understand the history behind it. And that layering is made possible by the use of Gothic, and in particular of Gothic ruins. Now, as I said, it has become a cliche in modern cinema to stage climactic battles in Gothic spaces. It's very, very interesting why this has happened. So I'm going to give you a few examples now. I'm not recommending that you see in these films. You certainly don't have to see many of them. They're not good movies. But nonetheless, it is interesting that the production designers have fallen back on this solution. So we have Spider-Man 3, where Spider-Man has been infected by the alien venom and has turned black. As you can see here, this is not the red good Spider-Man, this is the black evil Spider-Man perched atop this Gothic structure. Here's our beautiful Gothic arch, our buttresses, etc. Or we have the climactic battle in Venom 2, filmed on the cathedral in San Francisco. This is CGI'd in, but much of this is actually real, and then they added their CG animation around it, but you can see again very clearly all of this Gothic architecture here. We have the Batman from 2022, the most recent remake, where there is a very dramatic scene that takes place inside of a cathedral, which was actually a set, but nonetheless, I think you can see, I think you can see here very clearly we have a Gothic window with our Gothic tracery. We have rib vaults that are visible up here. We have the Sandman series, where there is a climactic encounter between the Sandman and John Dee, which takes place in a cathedral space. You can see that the cathedral is burning up, but you can see very clearly the rib vaults and the pointed arches and the beautiful columns, the piers. We have his Dark Materials, based on the books by Philip Pullman, another Brit, by the way. This was a 3-season series, and here in one of the climactic battles, we have an encounter with the Almighty and various figures, and you can see that we are in a kind of modern, expressionistic Gothic space with a large Gothic arch back here, and piers again that evoke the piers in the nave of a Gothic cathedral. We have Dungeons and Dragons from 2023. You can see very clearly the Gothic architecture here in the background. This is going to be the setting for the climactic battle. And we have the ending of The Crown, where the queen is walking out of this structure, this beautiful Gothic structure, and walking out into the light, clearly walking out into heaven. This is a kind of heavenly, transcendent image. She has achieved her life's dream. She has been the perfect queen, and now she gets her reward. What's going on here? Because I could have given you many, many more examples of this. Well, I think that one way to interpret this constant use of Gothic architecture is, frankly, laziness. It is an indication of a kind of exhaustion among creators who are looking to make battle scenes or encounters, or in this case, finales, dramatic, transcendent, mystical, and who are hoping to evoke very quickly, through architecture, the conflict between good and evil. And the best way to do that is to set these battles in a Gothic space which evokes the religious, the transcendent, and the Christian. And let's be very clear, I'm not saying that these films are necessarily Christian allegories, but it is inevitable that in these stories, because you have a very clear opposition between good and evil, you can ultimately derive that from Christian morality. And so setting this within a Christian space, or a space that evokes Christian architecture, is actually very appropriate to the moral message that you're trying to convey. That's one reading. It's a cliche. But another way to think about this is to look back to the Gothic revival. So for example, in the 19th century, there was an organization set up to help to build more Anglican churches in England. And by the time that they had finished their work toward the end of the 19th century, 2/3 of the over 300 churches that they had constructed were Gothic. My point is that even during the Gothic revival, Gothic had become something of a cliche. Gothic was, in a sense, everywhere in certain contexts. You just expected to see it. So it's, I think, ungenerous or perhaps overly critical to say that all of this use of Gothic is a cliche or the sign of an exhausted creative culture. I think what's more accurate is to say that this use of Gothic is in some ways inevitable. Because if you have a climactic battle, something that is meant to evoke the clash of universal forces, in most other spaces, it's simply not going to work. Can you have these figures fighting in a mall? In a parking lot? In a bank? Is that going to work? Probably not. And so you want an architecture that elevates it, that makes it feel like there are stakes in the battle that you are watching. And I think that that's really why all of these creators are turning to this architecture for these moments in their stories. So, to conclude, I think that because the Gothic revival is now digital, it's also gone global. And here's what I mean. First of all, we have anime produced mainly in Japan. Going back to examples like this, The King of Thorn, can you see the Gothic influences here? Can you see the buttresses and the spires? And we've got Gothic arches that are kind of hard to make out. I couldn't find a really high-resolution image, I'm sorry. But that's thoroughly Gothic, and it has a kind of hodgepodge feeling like Hogwarts does. Well, this is Japanese animation, but it is using Gothic in order to create the story world within its anime film. Or we have an example like this. This is a wonderful example of dark Gothic again, because this is a story about vampires. Can you see this very elaborate Gothic structure that these figures are walking into? You can see these beautiful Gothic windows, Gothic tracery here on these small rose windows, beautiful Gothic tympanum up here, this massive doorway. So this is, as it were, a massive Gothic cathedral that these figures are walking into. So a use of Gothic to evoke the dark, the vampiric, the monstrous, the horrific, which is a tradition that we see going back to Caspar David Friedrich, for example. Then we have video games. And this is an example from a very popular video game series called Assassin's Creed. My students are the ones who tell me about this stuff. I know nothing about video games. I do not have the time to play video games. But I am very interested in how video games use Gothic, and apparently they use it a lot, and there are even games that allow you to build your own Gothic structures. This is the interior of Notre Dame, and you can see very clearly the beautiful rose window here, beautiful Gothic tracery. This is very well done. This is very well rendered. And then we have AI-generated Gothic structures. Now, literally anybody, any one of us, could simply go on our phones and go to one of these AI generative sites and type in Gothic cathedral, Gothic castle, Gothic whatever, and it's going to generate something for us. And it will be interesting at the very least. And here you can see that these are Gothic images produced by AI. AI knows exactly what Gothic is. It's got a very good idea. Pointed arches, big windows, flying buttresses, rib vaults. It's got all the elements. It's also got the mystery. It's got the romantic side to it as well. You can see the shading that it has, the sense of ruin here with the light filtering through and the darkness down here. This is very pretty. This is intriguing. So here's what I'd say to conclude. In the past, the builders of Gothic were the stonemasons, and then the other artists got involved. And that was really from the beginning of Gothic. And now as we've gone through in time, what has happened, in fact, is that the appropriation of Gothic has simply expanded into another realm of media. And it was to be expected. Of course the digital world was going to get its hands on Gothic. Of course we were going to see this kind of explosion. But what is interesting now, to me, is to see what's going to happen to the meanings and the uses of this Gothic. As Gothic becomes more global, as it leaves the Western Judeo-Christian realm with its black and white morality, with its specific cultural hierarchies, I think that Gothic is going to take on more and more meanings, and it's going to become increasingly different and variegated and multifaceted. And that, I think, is going to be a very interesting and very enriching future for Gothic. Thank you very much.